Acts chapter 20, verses 7 to 12, and I'm reading from the New International Version. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Oh, look at that. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he would not shut up. I'm sorry, wait. He kept on talking until midnight. Don't you hate it when preachers do that? Right? I know, right? There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. So this is Dr. Luke retelling the story. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul was boring all the Jesus out of him. I'm sorry, as he talked on and on and on and on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. My. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. Don't be alarmed, he said. He's alive. Oh, Jesus. Then he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. And believe it or not, preached another 6 hours, talking until daylight, until he left. That must have been some important message. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he once wrote and said that the church is the church when it exists for others. Say that again. Okay, I was going to do that, but okay, that's good. That lets me know you all are with me this morning. That's a good thing, right? And I really want us to hover over that thought. We're not going to spend a lot of time there, but, if you want to know why are we at FRC doing everything that we're doing, that's part of the reason. Because as God's church, as Christ's body, we weren't created for ourselves or to do the things that please and make us happy. If that's Jesus, tell him I call him back. But we were created and we exist for others. During the pandemic, when the city was under lockdown, like most, I had the opportunity to listen to a lot of podcasts and YouTube videos and all that kind of stuff, right? And there was one particular one where they were discussing what the Christian response to the protest of police using excessive force, leading to the loss of life, right? That while all hell, if you will, was breaking loose across our country, these particular individuals were wrestling with what should the Christian's response be? And admittedly, they acknowledged that the issue was complex. Because if you're like me, as you get older, you do tend to appreciate the police. I don't run as fast, can't fight as fierce as I once used to. And so, yeah, they do serve a role. But then there is the other side of that. How much is too much? At what level is accountability come into play? Right? And so the thing that struck me was amidst all of the other chatter that was going on, one of the individuals on the panel said that the starting point is for God's people to care. That God's people have to care about what happens to others. And that statement honestly caused me to think deeply about what does it mean, FRC, to be the church on mission with Jesus today. And part of the difficulty with answering that particular question is the reality that every church in Brooklyn, there are approximately 12 to 13 Reformed churches, approximately. And every church exists in a different context. God has planted and God has placed every church in a different community with a different setting, with a different set of circumstances. And so the presenting problems that one church may face are not going to be the same as those faced by another church. That the needs of the people in East Flatbush are very different than the needs of those in Canarsie. Hello, somebody. Right? That the needs of those of us who reside here in Flatlands are very different than the needs of those in Marine Park and Mill Basin. Yes, they are our brothers and sisters. And so I want to suggest to you this morning that being on mission with Jesus is going to look different. It's going to look different. That being on mission with Jesus essentially is God asking his people to be shaped by the place where God has planted us. I suspect that another challenge to this idea of being on mission with Jesus, and when I talk about being on mission, essentially what I'm talking about is participating in God's work of renewal, restoration of all things. Revelation 21, that's where I'm living. Revelation 21. That another challenge for you and I today in the 21st century is the reality that the Bible itself does not prescribe a specific formula. That many theologians today have come to the conclusion and advocate that the people of God need to stop treating the Bible like a how-to book. That's part of the problem. That the Bible doesn't specifically say to you and I here at Flatlands, do this or do that. Has anyone seen that passage? Come on, talk to me. Right? No. But what the Bible does do, church, is it asks us to look at Jesus and to look at other biblical characters and how they have approached this same question. And then for you and I to come together in community and to consider, what would it look like if we took our cues from them? If we drew from the approaches that they used in our own setting? What would it look like to actually live out Jesus' instructions? That if you have an issue with someone, Jesus said, go and repair that relationship before you come to offer God your praise and worship. Now, what would that look like? Church might be empty on Sunday morning. Where's everybody? They're going to repair broken relationships. Or how about this one? What if we took the passage that says, are we willing to interrupt what we are doing? This particular passage. Are we willing to interrupt what we were doing? You know, those really, really important things. That when the doorbell rings, we start fussing and cussing, because people are interrupting us. They're taking us away. Well, this passage is asking us, are we willing to be interrupted, to be with, to provide care for another that would lead to their restoration? And before you try to hit me over the head with a loophole, the text isn't talking about your blood and your kin. It's not talking about the people that we know well. But potentially, it may be people that, there's some hard feelings that exist between us. Those people that we may feel don't actually deserve God's grace and God's mercy. What would it look like, FRC, to be the incarnational, which simply means the human presence, the missional, which simply means doing the work of the kingdom, presence of Jesus in our world today? Because I promise you, for each of us that are here, those of you that are worshiping virtually, it's going to look different. It's going to look different. Several years ago, I was faced with a choice where I could either continue pouring all of my time and my energy into Sunday morning and what was happening inside the church, or I could risk angering the consistory and committing personal or pastoral hara-kiri by stepping away so that I could be with others outside the church who needed someone to care about them and their soul. And so if Dietrich Bonhoeffer is correct, the church is the church when it exists for others. I need us to think about, what does that look like? What does that mean to us? One of the keys to understanding this particular passage of Scripture is we have to begin by understanding that the central character, the Apostle Paul, that he was shaped by Jesus and by the love of Jesus, not only for himself, but for all people. Right? That when Jesus encountered Paul on the Damascus road, Paul did not just have a spiritual conversion, but Paul had a heart transplant. Right? That Paul's heart became captivated and arrested by God's heart through Jesus. That his heart became radically altered and shaped, such to the point that it began to resemble the heart of God. And out of God's heart, what we see here is Paul expressing God's care and God's concern for people, for communities, cities, nations, and all of creation. And this is why, church, you and I cannot divorce faith from life. Right? Because life for God's people is lived by faith. Faith either in someone or something. And whatever our faith is in, that is what will shape and reshape how you and I live and how we approach life. No, you don't believe me? Well, consider a previous iteration of this same fellow Paul who was called Saul. That particular version was shaped by the law of Moses. He was a legalist. And his hope and his faith was in the law. In other words, if I just follow all the rules. He was a rule keeper. And because he was a rule keeper, we read in chapter 7 of this same book that this fellow who was willing to go help others in 7 was a bystander watching as Stephen was being stoned. Right? In fact, not only was he a bystander, he was a valet. He was holding the coats of those who were doing the execution, and he was approving, believing that Stephen got what he deserved. That was Acts chapter 8. 12 chapters later, we see the same person who approved and participated in the taking of human life, being on the front line, working tirelessly to preserve, to restore, to resurrect someone who had been declared dead. No hope. Don't even bother. What do we put our hope and our trust in? Okay. Because whatever it is going to shape how we view and how we approach life. And so, BC Paul, he put his hope and his trust in the rules. That if I just follow all of the rules, if I do everything the right way. But something happened. Because A.D. Paul becomes someone who cares about what happens to people. And you know, let me say this. One of the takeaways from this passage is the fact that bad actors can become better people when their hearts have been changed by a living Christ. Hello, somebody. I'm going to say that again. That bad actors can become better people when their hearts have been changed by a living Christ. Stop saying that people can't change. What we need to say is they need to encounter Jesus. And so Paul's change is reflected in the way that the apostle saw himself. Right? If we listen to the way that Paul spoke about himself, not here, but in other parts of Scripture, where Paul says that I am a slave for Christ. He says that to have Christ is to have everything, and anything else is garbage. It's rubbish. And so the change that Jesus brought to Paul and his life was so thorough that Paul stopped living for himself and began living for Jesus. And you know, this is one of the tensions that you and I must wrestle with as Christ followers. The human struggle with selfishness. Right? That one of the things Paul says to us in this passage is, for those who want to overcome selfishness, start practicing selflessness. But that's only if you want to overcome selfishness. Some people might be happy with that. You know, one of the people, and actually almost every person that the Lord used to disciple me, did so by being a living example. God knew that I'm thick and I need to see it. I got to see it so that I can become it. And these people that God used, he used them to emphasize doing as a bridge to becomings, right? And one person in particular, love him to death. He did things like, you ready for this? He held the door open for others so they could go in ahead of him. Imagine that. He did things like driving folks home after meetings. Imagine. Or this one is going to really knock you out. Whenever we were in large group gatherings, he would let everyone else eat before he ate. That if you want to become like Jesus, you need to practice the practices of Jesus. That what the text tells us is that God will serve up some situations and ask God's people to put their money where their mouth is. That if you really want to be like Jesus, prove it. Prove it. Prove it. Maybe that's why Jesus' brother James said things like, don't get tired of doing well, of doing good. Right? Don't get tired of doing the right thing because it's the right thing. That when you and I practice intentional acts of selflessness, It allows us to check that George Costanza impulse. Any Seinfeld folks in here? There was an episode in Seinfeld where a fire broke out in a kitchen at a kid's party. And George knocked down all the women and children rushing to get out. And when his girlfriend asked him why he did it, he said, "I was clearing the way for everyone else." Selfishness, the impulse that drives God's people to sacrifice others on the altar of I, myself, and me. And so as we build a bridge from our text to today, Eutychus represents all of those who are outside the community of faith. Those who are hurting, who are in distress, and in need of critical care. Right? And the text wants you and I, or is asking, what is our response to them? Right? How will we respond to those who are in critical situations, irrespective of their ethnicity, their gender, their socioeconomic status, political affiliation, sexual orientation, or any other identity marker? Or let me put it another way. Do we care, FRC? Right? Do we really care about our brothers, our sisters, and our neighbors? Those who are living around us. Do we care about what they are going through? Do we care about their struggles? Do we care if they live or die? Do we care? And so I want to leave you this morning with 3 thoughts to take with you today. That Paul helps us he gives us a visual of what it looks like when God's people care. Number 1, they show up. Paul could have continued preaching and teaching because Eutychus, remember, he was believed to be beyond saving. And so it would have been easy for Paul to just simply count Eutychus as another statistic, but he didn't do that. Paul saw the value in at least trying to revive someone who others had written off. You know, as a pastor, I get all kinds of requests. Things like blessing people's pets, to performing vow renewal services for Buddhists. And some time ago, I received a call from someone who is a community partner, does not attend services here, so stop trying to think who it is. And this person had been hospitalized due to an emergency and was in critical condition. And they didn't call me directly. They asked someone else to call me. Now, you know the call came at a time when I had a million other things going on, right? And was bone tired. And so Jill and I decided that we would pray God's strength and make that trek uptown. As soon as we walked into this little closet that the hospital created because they were packed to capacity, off to the side, as a little ICU unit, this person broke down and wept. And I'll never forget what they said. They said that everyone they thought cared about them, no one but us showed up. Paul showed up for Eutychus, right? Because when God's people care, they show up for others. Number two, when God's people care, they push back against the things that compromise human life. Now, if you can picture this particular scene, right? They're in this room like this, packed to capacity. And so, because it was before AC, it was hot up in there. How many of us know that God's people draw heat? Don't get too much of us together, because you'll be passing out and getting the sleepy. Oh, yeah. We draw some heat, right? And Paul, instead of trying to tell the old story, he tried to tell the whole story. And all of these factors contributed to the fact that Eutychus got an attack of the sleepies and the brother fell out. Now, Paul could have done the good Christian thing and blamed the victim, right? It was his fault. He should have been paying attention, right? He shouldn't have been sitting so close to that window. Blah, 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 blah. And while all of those things may be true, they did not discount the reality that there were some other things going on in that space that contributed to our brother being in the situation that he was in. Remember Jesus' parable about the soils. That sometimes, church, there are things in the environment that will undermine not only God's people, but all people's ability to do well. And what the Lord calls upon his people to do is to work toward the removal of those things. That if you want to know what it looks like to be pro-life, that pro-life means we will engage against the fight that compromises, undermines, and threatens or holds the potential to destroy all life. Hello, somebody. From the womb to the tomb. That the biblical view of pro-life, yeah, it's going to get uncomfortable this morning, is the acknowledgement of the value of human life, that it has already been predetermined by God, who is the author and progenitor, big word that just means source of all life. And to borrow from Job, if only God gives life, then only God reserves the right to reclaim that life. And I'm going to let that settle right there. The only other thing that I would add is that when you study the Gospels, Jesus encountered many people who were in dire straits. And Jesus always first worked to help them see that their situation was not as bad as it seems. And that God always has a viable option. A few years ago, I was asked to sit on the board of an organization called Adoptive Families for Foster Care. And the reason that I considered it was because I recognized that this was God's viable option. Hello, somebody. That instead of letting the young man die, Paul's efforts to revive and to restore him represent that God always has other viable options to preserve human life. And that as God's people, as we work for the kingdom, we must be committed to pushing back against the things that threaten, that undermine, and that will try to take the lives of those around us. But number three, when God's people care, they become participants in God's recreative and restorative work. Rather than just allow Eutychus to be another statistic, another young man with a bright and promising future. But due to some unfortunate twist of fate, who lost his life, Paul, being motivated by the Spirit of Jesus, decided that he was going to participate in the Lord's recreative and restorative work. In other words, Paul was going to change the narrative. That when God's people care, God's vision of a renewed earth that has been restored, where everything and everyone living is living into God's original intent and design. That is the church's frame of reference from which God's people operate. Because when God's people operate from God's vision, then allowing our communities and our neighborhoods to remain depressed, blighted, and deprived of resources is unacceptable. The mistreatment of migrants, immigrants, and refugees is unacceptable. The disregard for the loss of life of our children, our brothers, our sisters, and anyone else, when God's people care, is unacceptable. That when God's people care, God's people accept God's invitation to become instruments of God's restoration and resurrection right where we are. I leave you with this. That when God's people care, very often, it changes the direction and the trajectory of others around them. The individual that Jill and I went to visit, by simply being present, it opened up a space for us to share Jesus with this person. That's right. That's right. When God's people care. Right? That the goal isn't to get people into heaven, church. But the goal is to introduce people to this Jesus who wants them to know God so that they can begin to see God's new vision for their lives, and collectively we can begin to live into God's new vision of a renewed, a restored, and a resurrected earth. When God's people care. As we prepare to transition to the Lord's table, let us prepare our hearts and minds to encounter and to experience the living Christ who is with us here today.